I'm going to talk about other sources of data that can enhance and support your analysis and sales presentations that you do using the depletions data. And apologies in advance if this presentation is a little bit tilted towards, a lot tilted perhaps, towards the wine market in the US. That's about 2/3 to 3/4 of my business. But although the data and content will change, the principles are actually applicable across a wide range of almost all beverage alcohol and indeed many food categories as well. So bearing in mind Hugh's comment early on, I do not have a 117-slide PowerPoint presentation. We're just going to briskly move through about 97 of them, okay? So, and yeah, who needs lunch anyway? No, actually there are only 20 slides. The content's fairly dense though, but if you want to, like, I'm going to be around all day, so you can just buttonhole me if there's something you didn't quite catch or you've got a follow-up question or something like that. So just a quick review. Point out, I do have experience. I have been a brand manager. I have done sales. I've worked retail. So I try to make my research designs as practical and applicable as they can be, because I know, you can just load down people with tons of data and things that are interesting and nice to know, but not necessarily applicable. So we do try to do that in our research. And there's a variety of things we do. Category outlook and trend, what are consumer trial and ratings of Sauvignon Blanc, which consumers are trying and purchasing Radler-style beers, that's that kind of stuff. Sales analysis, we might analyze club versus ad hoc purchasers at your winery or on your mailing list, for example. We do consumer and trade research. I'm not going to talk about the trade research side really much at all today, but that's an interesting contrast to consumers. And then he mentioned the Wine Opinions Panel. Just for those who aren't really aware of it, the Wine Opinions Panel is a national consumer panel of over 17,000 high-frequency, high-involvement, and high-end wine consumers across the US. They represent this key category going back to Ben's 80-20 rule. The high-frequency wine consumers in the US do purchase over 80% of the wine, and high-involvement, high-end wine consumers purchase probably 90% or more of the wines over $20. So it's very representative of that sort of key group. And then there's also a 4,000-member trade panel comprising people all the way from tasting room managers through wholesalers down to sommeliers. So just a quick glance at sort of the structure of data. We're not going to spend a whole bunch of time there, but where is the data? It's important to figure out what kind of data is available where. We're here today focusing on this, what's the wholesale level data, depletions, which can, as you've seen, you can do a lot of marvelous things with in great detail, and it's really expanding the uses for it. Unfortunately, in general, it's only your data. So you can slice and dice your data in great detail, but you don't necessarily know what's happening in the market as a whole. Similar problems that you can get overall data, but not very precise individual winery or varietal data up here at the top level in terms of supply and so on. Going down to the retail level, scanned off-premise data represented by Nielsen IRI. This is incredibly rich and deep and precise data source and includes all your competitor information, but it doesn't cover everything. Non-scanned off-premise retail, there's very little here. Some things are being developed, but really this is kind of a black hole of data. On-premise is limited, although Nielsen's new alliance, or their owning of TD Lynx, they're developing some interesting products on that front, so that's worth keeping an eye on. And then you do have some decent data, although it's projected, it's not complete, but it is decent data here. And then down at the consumer level, you've got both social media monitoring and actual consumer research to inform you on what consumers are thinking and so on. So what do these other data sources give you that you don't already have sitting in-house? Well, third-party confirmation. They're a neutral source of data, may have more credibility with your distributors or brokers or the people you are selling to at the retail level. It allows you comparisons with competitors, and this competitor data is often key to presentations on new product introductions or gaining share of display or promotion or by the glass or tap placements and so on. It's evidence of consumer pull-through and appeal, and this is something, it's hard data at the consumer level, and often that's the only way to actually prove consumer appeal for a new product or if you're expanding into a new market, which is something, of course, the buyers really want to see. And finally, you've got diagnostics. Depletions will tell you what is or isn't selling and where. The other research can help you figure out why. Merchandising, response to display, consumer perception, sensory analysis, all of these things can feed into the whys. So you can both make internal decisions that are good and also provide you with some fact-based selling arguments. So we could spend a whole day on all these different data sources, but I'm going to focus on 3 in particular to illustrate ways of using them. So scan data. How many people are highly familiar with scan data or use it from Nielsen or IRI? Fair number of people, about half the room. Okay, so I won't spend a whole lot of time sort of explaining it. But basically, stores sell or give their data to Nielsen or IRI, and the IRI or Nielsen organize it, clean it up, and resell it to companies. And it's a huge amount of data with powerful metrics, as I have mentioned before. There are some important caveats, though. If you read articles and look at the trade press, sometimes you get the impression that scan data represents the universe of wine or beer sales as it exists. And actually, there are some important parts of it that are missing. It's missing some important chains for beverage alcohol, Costco, TJ's, Whole Foods. These chains don't feed into the scan data universe. It's got very good coverage of these channels, but in liquor stores, it tends to be focused on some chains and large liquor stores. It is missing the long tail of high-end fine wine shops or craft beer-oriented stores and so on. Of course, there's no on-premise data. It's strictly off-premise retail. And so the gist of it is that for some kinds of products, it's extremely representative, and you can really take it as a proxy for the market overall. But other categories, wines over $20, certain countries' products, France, Spain, South Africa, tend to be underrepresented in chains. Many subcategories, Zinfandel over $15, craft cider, tap-oriented craft beer, which is a lot of the producers, are underrepresented by scan data. So just be aware of that when you are using it. And here's kind of a quick map of the world of off-premise retail data in the wine category. The bottom green here, the bottom section here, what we see is grocery foods, percentage of dollar sales, share of dollar sales for all table wine on the left and for table wine over $20 on the right. And so you can see that, it drops off the proportion that's covered by scan data, with the exception of places like Trader Joe's or Whole Foods and some others. It drops off over $20, whereas the liquor wine, which has limited coverage with scan data, expands greatly once you go above $20. Same phenomena with mass market, which is mostly covered by scan data quite well. So you see, you're looking at sort of 2 different universes there data-wise. Okay, with that in mind, nonetheless, here's a typical example of scan-based information. This is the kind of stuff you'll see published often in public spheres. And it has sales and value, dollar sales and share and so on, with the varieties listed. And it might be price segments. You might see it by size of bottle and so on. And you'll see this frequently. But there's a lot more detailed data in the scan data universe that can be used in fact-based selling. And these are the kind of numbers that can be leveraged, even if you're not in the top 10 list of sales. So let's take a quick look at some of those. They've got market definitions down to specific chains or even individual stores that you can work with. They've got measures like the average number of SKUs per store, percentage stores with distribution, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just going to point out 2 of them that are interesting for usage. The percentage of stores with various forms of promotion. If you look in the middle there, you can see you can get the percentage of stores with a temporary price reduction or on sale, percentage of sales that you're making in those stores for any particular product. Similarly with store advertisements or displays. Well, these have obvious applications for both monitoring your execution of promotions and figuring out what kind of response and lift you have at the retail level. Another really interesting measure that I think is underused is base sales. And what they do is they've got an algorithm in both IRI and Nielsen data that will will not only remove the stores where the product is on promotion, say Miller's Pinot Noir is on promotion, but also calculate how much in those stores with promotion the sales would have been without that promotion by backing out of the sales lift. And so this is really an indication of what's the real consumer demand or pull off the shelf for a product. Very useful if you're trying to compare your product versus someone else who just has a dominant merchandising and promotion program, which is really what's driving their sales, not necessarily consumer pull. So here's a quick example of just using some of those other measures. Let's look at, let's say, my Pinot Noir in Atlanta, and I'm trying to expand distribution. So what are the incremental sales? Obviously, the person I'm selling to wants to know, well, how much do you think you'd sell in our chain? For planning with our distributor, we'll want to know how much we can anticipate selling in that chain, both to add to the inventory to supply that and to figure out how much of an incentive or merchandising program we can afford. So what we do is we take a look at the sales rate in the overall market for Miller's Pinot Noir, and then we look at the volume sales in that's 12 weeks, say 110 cases, and we divide it by what they call ACV, percentage distribution. Think of that as just the percentage of stores that you're in. ACV is just a way of weighting the stores for their size, but essentially it's percentage store distribution. So we have 22 points of ACV, so we end up with 5 cases per 1% distribution. Now, if I'm going in and trying to sell to chain X, and they have a 15% share of the whole market, all commodity volume in Atlanta, but they don't carry my Pinot Noir. Well, now I can take that sales rate that I found from the previous calculation, and I can project that if you only do as well as the average store in the market, and of course what buyer wants to think they'll merely do as well as the average store in the market, but if you only do as well as the average store in the market, you can anticipate an additional 300 cases of Miller Pinot Noir during the year if you put it into chain X. So, useful information. And, oh, by the way, if you analyze depletions alongside this kind of data, you can also prevent things like over-inventorying or giving a discount on too much of your sales inventory in anticipation of promotion programs. It's a little more complicated, but it's something you can do. Let's turn to consumer research and surveys. And why do consumer research? Well, there's when you've got so much on your plate, just getting sales executed and so on. Well, there are several reasons. One is with so many choices for buyers in the trade these days, a new or unique selling proposition or evidence of that can break a tie when choosing between a couple of products. Another thing is that with so many choices and such crowded shelves, lists, and warehouses, buyers want hard evidence that a new product will pull through. And in other words, evidence of consumer liking or demand for that product. So you could say to yourself, well, why not just ask, the trade people, the buyers, your sales force or whoever, what do you think of this package? What are people buying? What are the trends? Because they're out in the field all the time and, they hear feedback and you have to sell through them anyway. Well, the thing is, just because trade members know a lot about the product and know a lot about sales and know a lot about trade attitudes, they often don't know exactly what's going on in the consumer's mind. And just to give you a couple of examples, let's take the sideways example. How many people have heard of the sideways' impact on Pinot Noir? Very big. Okay, and keep your hands up if you've also heard of sideways impact on Merlot, decreasing Merlot sales. Yeah, a fair number of people. It's pretty famous. Well, the funny thing is that the former is true, but the latter is not at the consumer level. And we did a year after Sideways came out, we took a large representative sample of core wine consumers and asked them if they'd seen a bunch of movies, and asked them if they were increasing, decreasing, or remaining the same on a bunch of different varieties. And what you found was a profound impact on Pinot Noir sales increasing. But really, there was not much difference between the people who had seen Sideways and the people who had not seen Sideways in their Merlot consumption. So the Sideways Merlot thing was really driven by trade and media, not by actual consumer reaction. So that's why you might want to do consumer research. Another quick example is Zinfandel. You ask a bunch of sommeliers or the press, does Zinfandel have a reputation of being alcoholic and overripe? Well, 78% of the trade panel, Wine Opinions trade panel, said yes. But then when you looked at frequent wine consumers, in high involvement, high kind of geeky wine consumers, 31% of them agreed. And when you went down to the people who actually buy Zinfandel frequently, only 8% of them agreed. So very big difference between the trade and actual consumers on some points. Okay, so let's take a look at some actual consumer research. In this case, we're going to take a look at a category level example, specifically overlap between certain categories. So just taking a look at this table, what you see here is we took all wine drinkers, and that includes even people who just have a glass a few times a year. So it's really about over half of the US drinking population is in this group. And then we asked them if they drink more than once a month, domestic craft beer, imported beer, and ale, domestic beers outside of craft, in other words, mainstream domestic beer, and cider. And you see some really interesting patterns when you break it down by generation, with millennials tending to be larger on domestic craft beer and cider by far, as you'd expect. Gen X coming in around the middle to upper end on all of them, and then it fading off on all things except domestic mainstream beer for baby boomers. So this is kind of interesting information you could certainly use. It has implications if you're making an argument to turn over some domestic beer taps to cider or craft beer, if you're trying to substitute some craft beer for imports on the shelf. Boomer-oriented accounts may not be interested in adding any cider, but certainly a millennial-oriented account should be considering that. Wholesalers who are looking to the future might ramp up or start looking for more cider and craft brands because the millennial Gen X portion of the market is, of course, going to be decreasing and the older portion declining. Here's another example of applying consumer research at the kind of category level. This is some research we did on frequent buyers of 750 and 1.5 liter sizes. And notice about 2/3 of regular 750 buyers in the wine market also buy 1.5s several times a year. So there's a big overlap. But there are differences in how they buy these things. So what we did was we asked them in the survey, we asked them over on the left there, you can see, when do you buy which size and why? And the largest number, 46%, said, well, I buy the one that has the best price or happens to be the exact brand I'm looking for. But a very large number, 39%, said, I buy them both, but I use them for different types of occasions. And when we drilled down to what kind of occasions they use them for, you found that 1.5 liters, half of them use them for parties, meeting with friends, dinner parties. Then you got another large group saying it's for large groups, gatherings, family gatherings. And then only after that you get served after work, everyday use, dinner, casual use. On the other hand, that's the leading, by 3/4 of the people, leading occasion for using 750s, because you don't want to pop open a whole 1.5 for pizza with your significant other on Wednesday. Most people don't. Yeah, not there yet. So, and you can see, on the other hand, parties, meeting with friends, dinner parties for 750s, even at that middle price range, has got a 1/5 of them. And not as much for 1.5. So, I mean, a larger number for 1.5. So you do see different occasions, and this has obviously implications for how you merchandise, what kind of promotion you want to run. It also provides an argument for when you walk into a retailer, don't add DC my 750 just to add my 1.5 and vice versa. So useful sales arguments from category level research. Let's look at packaging as the last little piece of the puzzle here. And obviously packaging is a really critical thing because especially for small and medium-sized producers, you don't have huge ad budgets, people aren't going to have vast awareness. Packaging is your primary means of communication with the consumer. So picking the right package from a producer point of view is obviously really important. But it's also can be part of the sales and marketing communications to the trade. So, for example, we did some research for Zork closures. Is everyone familiar with Zork? It's a plastic closure, kind of an elaborate look to it. Right up there in the upper right-hand corner, that's what a Zork looks like. It's very easy to take off and peel and so on. It's kind of an interesting, visually it kind of pops, so it's interesting. Some people like it, some people don't like the looks, but it certainly is visually attractive in the literal sense. And then it also makes reclosing really, really easy. So what we did was, the first thing we did for this research was we actually surveyed wine consumers as to what are the key features of a closure. And is airtight came out by far on the top. And then the second most important was protecting against TCA or corked wines or other flaws. But then also quite important was ease of opening and resealing. So we're thinking, aha, there might be an opening there. So then we exposed these consumers to actual examples of Zork and asked them, whether they agreed with a series of statements. And you had very high agreement with, I believe this type of closure would be easier to open than typical corks. And then 71%, a little bit farther down, say, I often reseal and save an unfinished bottle of wine. And then you have 3 to 1 in the middle there, say, of the people who did have an opinion on how good a quality seal it was, 3 to 1 in favor of being more reliable. So there you now, if you have a Zork enclosured wine, you now have 3 good selling points when you walk into your wholesaler or retailer. Over 1/3 say easy to open is an important closure feature. 79% think Zork is easier to open. Of those with an opinion, 3 to 1 believe Zork would be a more reliable seal than your average closure. And 70% say ease of resealing is important. 71% say they often reseal wine. Zork is easier to reseal than the other closures. Throw 3 consumer research-derived selling points. Choosing a new label, of course, we all know how important that is. We've already gone over that. And here's a case where what we did was this company had 3 distinct design directions for a new label, as well as considering whether they were actually improvements over the current label. So we'll call them Current, Shield, Diamond, and Red for the 3 new designs. And what we did as it wasn't all the research, but sort of the core member of the research, what we did is we threw it into a competitive label set. So you had these 4 competitors, and then the labels, the Current and the Shield, Diamond, or Red label were inserted randomly into the shelf set that the consumer was exposed to. And then each batch of consumers saw only 1 proposed label. And the 4 batches of consumers were balanced for wine buying habits and demographics and so on. So the only variable changing here in their choice or opinions is the label of our client. And so one of the things we did was ask them, which of the labels in that competitive set they associated with various attributes that are listed over on the left there. Best tasting wine, lowest quality wine, which is the best for serving to guests, et cetera, et cetera. And what you see is the red label came out significantly higher on best tasting wine, statistically tied for highest on most likely to buy, lowest on least likely to buy. So a good showing for the red label, that was the one chosen. And also importantly, it's significantly better than the current label on most of those attributes. Useful information for deciding which label to use, but also when presenting the new label to the trade. Okay, so putting some of this stuff all together in sort of a cohesive package with your depletions data. Let's suppose that you've got an issue with chain sales. They're actually declining. When you look at your dashboard here, you see chain sales declining, heading into the holiday season even worse for our Pinot Noir, our brand's Pinot Noir. And on top of that, what you can see when we look at scan data, we see we're like number 6 in the ranked in terms of dollar sales among Pinot Noirs in this mid-price segment. So looks like a problem. But on the other hand, when we delve a little deeper into the scan data, we find out that our dollar sales per 1% distribution are actually higher than the competitors. By the way, this is all this stuff I'm using the example is real data. I've masked the brands and so on, but this was all actual data for various products. And our response, our percentage increase in dollar sales on display is also higher. We just have fewer displays. So we don't have a consumer takeaway issue here. What we have is lack of distribution and lack of displays compared to some of the leading competitors. So let's put together, what we do is we put together a fact-based sales presentation to the buyer using these 2 data points. And then on top of it, we're going to introduce our new label, which will boost sales further. It came out highest out of Bogle, Mark West, Castle Rock, and BV for new label. The new label came out as highest as best tasting wine and also beat them on most likely to buy in this comparative sales set. So you've got fact-based selling presentation to the buyers, throw in some merchandising incentives, and you should be able to increase distribution and displays. One last example here. Let's suppose that our grapevines data indicates that our tap placements have declined versus last year and the previous period. So we need to turn that around. What we can do is put together a kind of combined program where, first of all, you might want to set up tap incentive program at the distributor level. That's clear enough, but you can use your grapevines software to monitor it. Using the depletions data, field survey, CRM, or demo geographic data, we build a target list of high volume accounts that skew younger and also have 10 plus taps. Remember that skewing younger apart from the earlier category information on cider. Now we use a field survey CRM to identify the accounts with 0 to 1 cider taps. And those of you who are selling craft beer, you can substitute a new craft beer category like Radler or Saison or something for cider, but it's the same principle. So now we have Salesforce with fact-based selling arguments for switching out a beer tap for cider, and we have their target list. They're the places with 10 plus taps where none of them or only one of them is a cider tap, and they're skewing towards younger consumers because cider skews younger, 44% of 20-somethings drinking it versus 21% of 30-somethings and only 5 to 15 of older percent. Of those who do drink cider, 78% say it's because it makes an interesting change from beer, a reason to have a cider tap included in your beer, among your beer taps. 32% are still experimenting to find out what style they like best. So if they already have one cider type, it'd be good to have a different cider type alongside it. And of those who don't drink cider, 44% want to try it. So you've got 3 good sales arguments there. You measure, follow up with your account surveys, monitor your grapevines depletions or CRM dashboards, and hopefully you turn around your tap problem. So that pretty much wraps it up. I'll be around all the day, as I said, if you've got other questions, but if we got time, I'll answer some questions now.